Hello and welcome to the DRBF's first webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on dispute board operations. I'm Ann Russo, Executive Director of the DRBF and your moderator for today's discussion. I'd like to start with a few logistical notes. This is a webinar, so there are some useful features available in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Today, we will use the Q&A window for submitting questions to be addressed by the panelists at the end of our discussion session. There is also a chat window, and you are free to use that chat for general commentary, but questions must be entered in the Q&A window to ensure that they are recorded and addressed by the panelists. We ask that you indicate which country you are from and who you would like to comment on your question. So as an example, I would say, I am from the US and I would like Hal to comment on X, Y, and Z. Today's webinar will be recorded and shared with members through our website afterwards. We also have another session at 3 UTC on 2 June, which is about 11 hours time. And this will be recorded and shared if you'd like to listen in on that session later. There is another useful feature called polls. And in a moment, I will invite each panel member to introduce themselves and give a short overview of their experience with virtual meetings to date. During this time, participants will see a poll pop up on the screen with a few short questions asking about your experiences to date with online proceedings. This will help us understand where our colleagues are today and frame the overall discussion. I will now turn it over to Elizabeth Tippin to introduce herself, followed by the other three panelists. Elizabeth?
Well, good morning from San Francisco. I currently serve as president-elect of the Region 1 Board of Directors, and my experience with virtual meetings has been approximately, I've organized and participated in about 10 virtual video DRB meetings. That's been both progress meetings and we've even done a kickoff meeting. I haven't done any hearings, but I have performed services as an arbitrator for both video and audio conferences of late, and all have gone great.
Great.
Leo.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Leo Grutters. I live in Germany. I am at the moment the president of Region 2 of the DRBF. I'm a practicing arbitrator adjudicator. I sit on dispute boards as a profession. I do this daily. I have been involved in virtual hearings and site meetings, and let's see what we can discuss about that today.
Very good. Andy?
Hi, good morning, afternoon or evening, depending where you are in the world. I'm Andy Griffiths. I'm currently the president of the DRBF Executive Board. So in that capacity, I'd like to really welcome everybody who's joining this call and everybody who joins tomorrow for this webinar. It's a new experience for us, and hopefully it's a good experience for you, and I hope you find it worthwhile. Since the outbreak of COVID-19, I've only had about 3 virtual DB sessions, 1 regular DB meeting, and 2 virtual sessions aimed at facilitating the evaluation of a very large and complex delay and disruption claim with expert witnesses. So that is a different process, but I'm sure some of you out there would have more experience than me, so we'd be very pleased to get your feedback at the end, any tips, any pitfalls you recognize to help us out as well, to develop better practice amongst our group. Thank you.
I'm Hal McKittrick. I'm a former president of the Executive Board of Directors of the DRBF. I'm a Matthews Award winner, and I've been a member of the foundation since '97. I've been practicing dispute boards for nearly 25 years. Due to COVID-19, like all of us, I've had experience recently in virtual meetings in several of the different media. I have even taken part as a DRB member in a hearing on the DRB as a DRB hearing. And in general, I find the use of virtual media acceptable to good. And
all right, very good. Thank you, Hal. All right, we're going to take this time to close the poll and publish the results, and that will give us a sense of where our audience stands. So on the question of having participated in online dispute board meetings, the majority have 64%, with just 36% not having participated in an online dispute board meeting. And as for hearings, a smaller percentage, only 24% of the attendees have had an online hearing, while 76% have not. And then we asked just a question for those who said yes above, how they would analyze the overall experience. The majority, 67%, say good, with 12% at excellent, 17% at fair, and 5% saying it was a poor experience. So I think that will help us frame the context for our discussions today. Thank you all for chiming in on the poll. Now we're going to go ahead and get started with our panel discussion. And I think we'll start from the beginning. Elizabeth, can you please share how the parties initially reacted to the shutdown of in-person meetings? Were they supportive of continuing dispute board operations?
I'm going to say definitely they were. I think that maybe the dispute board members took a little bit more coaxing than the parties. I think that most companies' disaster preparedness plans did not account for a massive pandemic such as COVID-14 or COVID-19. And there kind of was a lack of preparation about how to proceed. In February, I had a couple of arbitrations, face-to-face arbitrations, one in which a person was sick, and it was very uncomfortable. So I immediately signed up to be a Zoom host, and in the beginning of March, we had shelter in place in San Francisco, in California, the entire state, and I offered for a case project that I was chairing to do a Zoom virtual meeting, and the parties jumped at the opportunity. Yes, I trained the other DRB members so they'd feel comfortable in it, and I thought it worked very well. And since that time, everybody, I think, has come on board to using various formats, WebEx, etc. So it's been very good.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Elizabeth. Andy, can I ask you to comment on the same? How did the employers and contractors for your boards react initially?
Oh, very similar. Most of my practice is in Southern Africa and East Africa. Very similar. They were positive. Initially, when the outbreak started and all borders were locked and international travel was no longer permitted, the parties tended to think, well, let's postpone by a month or two. So we could still have the in-person meeting on site. They were, but as people have got used to the systems, the webinars in other parts of their business and practice, they grabbed the opportunity to engage in online hearings, online dispute board meetings, and so forth. The only challenge is sometimes the internet connectivity in a remote site is not quite there, so you have to be quite patient about that. But I think it's a growing impetus, and when we come to it, it's a huge benefit, particularly for the remote places where it may take you a day and a half travel time just to get to the site and back, that this medium, I think, is here to stay.
Very good. Thank you, Andy. I'm interested in how your fellow board members responded. Were they supportive of continuing DB operations? I've heard a variety of views from various DRBF members. So how can you share what your experience has been in the US with fellow board members reluctance or embracing of virtual meetings?
Actually, it's been very positive. First of all, in the DRB Foundation, we're all committed to keeping the DRB process ongoing. And this has enabled us to do just that. And so the membership or the members of the boards have been very supportive and enthusiastic about it. Sometimes it is the other parties to the three-party agreement that aren't so supportive of it.
All right, very good. Thank you, Hal. Leo, you work across international borders. So what's your experience been with fellow DB members' reaction to moving to the virtual space?
That's an interesting question because it depends a bit on the regions where you go. On one of my projects, my fellow board members initially weren't at all that keen on doing it. But I presume that was because nobody really knew where this was going and at that moment in time. And the other two board members, I hate to say this, but I think they had a little bit of inhibition in using the technique and didn't know what to expect and how to handle it. So there was this, let's wait and see, this COVID-19 will go away. But when it became clear that it wasn't going to go away, they turned around and we had to embrace it. And since we've done it, my fellow board members have become converted people. I, for one, I'm all for it. I do believe that the virtual online meetings is something to stay, and whether COVID-19 is going to stay or not, it's going to remain with us. So we all have to get used to it.
Very good. All right. Well, let's dig in a little bit deeper into the routine board meetings. So I'd like to hear, and this has been touched on a little bit, but how you organized your first virtual meeting, how the parties, or whether the parties set up the format, or whether you as the dispute board had to handle that side of it, what specific platforms you may have used for hosting the meetings. And as a side note to that, we've already received a question about whether issues of security about these online platforms have come into play in your decision-making and how you've handled that. And then also just some of the logistics, how did you handle pre-meeting documentation, distribution? Because the meeting was held online, was it recorded for the official record? That kind of thing. So maybe I'll start with Elizabeth to share your experience, and then we'll ask Leo to weigh in on the same question. Elizabeth?
The first virtual dispute board meeting was one that I hosted through Zoom. And this was in early March when the first shelter-in-place order came out in California. What I thought was key in that is, first of all, I worked with the two other dispute board members in training before that meeting so that they'd feel comfortable with the format. So we scheduled a time period where they could do, share screen and use the whiteboard and what is the chat, and just to become familiar with the format. The other parties were not familiar with it either, but we didn't do a training session. But at the first few minutes of the actual virtual meeting, we went over what some of the things were. And we did use the share screen concept so that we actually did a site tour using Google Maps. And the contractor showed us still images as well as the Google Maps to work on that. The next meeting that I had, one of the parties wanted to host it, and they used WebEx. We actually used a couple of different formats because it was a new project. And so we were organizing a kickoff meeting, and there were lots of virtual meetings that we had to develop the agenda, et cetera. And that went excellent. We had a new kickoff meeting. So we're meeting people for the first time, and I thought it worked very, very well. Another project I had was the construction was suspended. With that project, the parties decided that they did not want to move forward with the dispute board meeting, that they wanted to defer that until the project was, until they determined that the project would be back on track. So none of the meetings were recorded. And I think that that, you know, basically all of those meetings, the first one, I created meeting minutes. And so I distributed that to all the parties, but it was not recorded. And the second one, everybody just has their own meeting minutes. So we discussed it and decided that recording the meeting was not in the best format. And I did want to say that one of the discussion points was the rate that the dispute board members should charge. One of the projects was a daily rate, and we determined, the dispute board members determined collectively that we would charge a reduced daily rate, which we did that. The other one is just an hourly rate. So whatever hours we had to put in, you know, that was charged. But, you know, all in all, I think that it depends upon the project. And I don't think you have to have an established relationship with the parties, but certainly, you know, that helped with the virtual meeting the first one to just move into the Zoom meeting format. I think it's, you know, I would say that who's going to be the host is a question to be determined, because if you were actually having a hearing, you could do breakout rooms, and being the host, you know, as the chair, seems to me that it would be beneficial to do that so that you could do a breakout room with the actual 3 dispute board members, and exclude the other parties for how much time you needed. You can always set up another meeting if you want to, but sometimes you need that breakout room. So I think that's good. That's
very good. All right, thank you for that detail, Elizabeth. Leo, same question. How were your meetings organized for best success on the logistics side?
I think it was a bit of trial and error from the beginning. The very first one we did, we approached the parties with the question of how did they look at it? How did they feel about doing all this? And the parties were saying, yeah, we can do this, not a problem. And then it came to the logistics, and the parties unequivocally said, well, you're the DRB, you go and sort it out. So we were faced as the trio to come up with some rules and guides, and we didn't have a lot of clues either about at that moment in time. So we said, okay, well, let's use Zoom, and for the sake of taking one, that backfired, because at that moment in time, Zoom was going through some bad press because of security concerns. European contractor wasn't willing to partake if Zoom was going to be used. So we ended up going to GoToMeeting, another one of those platforms, and it worked well. What we didn't take into account in those days was that the project was in Africa, by the way, that we had an internet connection that wasn't too stable. So both parties had about 8-9 people on the call. So we had 20 people in the video room, which of course, in about 5 minutes, everything crashed. And that presented us with another problem, because switching off the cameras, well, we talked about uneasiness by DRB members that do not necessarily believe in this system, that they would like to see face-to-face meetings, so you can read some body language and the sorts of. But with closed off cameras, that's going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible. The next thing that we had to look at is document sharing. We started off by anybody that wanted to say something or share something, give him the share screen option, but that proved very unworkable. It became ineffective. So what we ended up doing in the afternoon session was that we got another person who had nothing really to contribute to the meeting per se, but that person was given the task of whenever a document was called for, call it up from a server, a mutual server between the parties. That was in place, by the way, that was an advantage, and just presented it to all of us. So we had one secretary's type of person who was helping us in looking at documents that needed to be shared, so that none of the parties nor the DRB needed to be concerned about all that. We also figured out very quickly that if you do a face-to-face meeting, you can easily go 8 hours a day. But if you do this online, people get tired of it. So we quickly saw that after about 3-4 hours, you have to ditch it. You have to then say, well, we take a longer break and come back maybe tomorrow. And the experience I've got is that with about 4 hours a day, that's the limit that people can handle. So you need to take it into account when you're planning these sort of meetings.
Very good, Leo. Thank you. In a related question, I'd like to ask specifically about virtual site meetings, site visits held in conjunction with the meeting. So have you utilized project photos, video recordings, live drone footage, Google Earth, or other tools to facilitate viewing the works that are in discussion? So how were these materials shared with the participants? How did it work practically during those meetings? How can you share with us your experience, please?
Yes, first of all, we use on the site of the project I'm going to talk about first is we use the GoToMeeting as the platform. Typically, for this particular meeting, we had been given by the contractor 700 job photos broken into categories, and we were asked to question them. At the day of the meeting, the intent had been to show us job progress at 6 major points with video cameras set up. Unfortunately, as luck would have it, even with a virtual meeting, there was a very, very rainy day on the site. Nobody was working. And so we then had to revert to a review of a number of the photos and discussion of those photos. But that's essentially the way we did that one. We had a first time project meeting earlier last month. And in that, it was an interesting project. We are actually a DRB that is a DRB for 3 different projects and 2 different contractors. So the way that was set up, it was more of a general overview meeting of the projects and the key the dates and the key elements of the project. But the owner had prepared detailed plans or illustrations of different sections of the project for that. But I have also heard that the people have used drones. There's all sorts of things you can do for a virtual site visit.
Very good. Thank you, Hal.
Yeah.
Now I'd like to ask Andy to comment on the same topic. And Andy, I know from earlier discussions, you actually had a little bit of experience on this issue pre-COVID on one of your remote site visits. So can you tell us about that experience and what you've been dealing with most recently in terms of viewing the works and having that component integrated into your meetings?
Yes, look, obviously nothing can actually replace with firsthand walking around a site, view activities that are going on, because then you as an individual look at what you want to look at as well. Although you go to certain vantage points or certain places where the parties explain what's going on. What's important with the photographs, I think as Hal said, they have to be properly compiled into sections. And then during the meeting, they can all be distributed beforehand. But during the meeting then, somebody has to take you through the photographs and explain in front of everybody why they took those photos, what is being shown. Also, the parties should agree what photos they're going to show. There's no point getting an inspector who's going to show you every piece of honeycomb concrete he can find in the entire project and give you that. You need to receive a balanced view all the time. So again, you have to control that. Videos, obviously with cell phones, videos are easy. Please, for whoever is taking the videos, please try and stay still. Don't bounce about or take it while you're driving around site. And please limit your commentary. So the dispute board will hear what's on the video, and that has to be shared with everybody. So again, it's better to have all these things silent and then have them shared during the course of a meeting and have it explained. And obviously you need a good number of photos. Yes, I've had the pleasure of having one with drone footage. And in fact, it was an excellent feature because it was a very high quality camera. So, and we were quite familiar with the site. So it was a large dam site and the drone would fly from upstream, downstream, turn around and fly back up and over the quarry and so forth. And it was excellent because you could also stop the footage and zoom in to look at progress in, obviously an overview, but you could look at it in more detail and you could do it at your own leisure. Okay. And I think for virtual meetings, if you've got a drone enthusiast on your site, it's well worth doing it. I think if you've got amateurs, well, you then get amateur footage, which can be next to useless. So I think you need some good drone operators. I have a dispute board member on a board I am, who is an avid drone photographer, and I think he's going to be delighted if he's allowed to bring his drone to site or get somebody to fly it over the site. Other thing to be careful when you go for video footage and drone footage, the files are enormous. So passing the files amongst the dispute board members is difficult. If you try and run it on a platform such as Zoom or WebEx, you'll probably quickly shut the whole system down. So maybe you've got to look at whether there are FTP sites available, big file transfer systems, Dropbox, all those, but then you've got to have enough storage to accept the files. So the logistics is very important to get benefit out of it. Okay.
Thank you, Andy.
No, that's about it.
Is that it? Okay, very good. Actually, you provided a lot of, I think, very tangible and useful tips, as well as some food for thought if anyone is getting ready to deal with a site visit in this virtual space and all those issues about the professionalism and quality of the materials, as well as the logistics of transferring that around to all the relevant parties. So thank you for raising those. I'd now like to switch to hearings. Aside from the platform of the virtual space, I'd like to hear how the structure of a virtual hearing differs from a routine meeting, and then how it also differs from in-person hearings. Hal, I know you've had this experience already. Can you please share your results with us?
Yes, and to start off, there is no substitute for a live in-person hearing, but virtual hearings can come pretty close. I finished one that ran 8 hours. We had 24 to 28 people present at different times. There were 4 presenters for each party. We had many typical distributions. We had distributions of position papers 2 weeks ahead of time. We had rebuttal papers 1 week ahead of time. We had the PowerPoints and the witness list 2 days before. And most importantly, we had an agreement not to record. And there is, I'm not sure of the controls on these platforms, but there was a definite agreement not to record. We also, during the meeting, the parties in rebuttal particularly would present certain documents. Now, in a regular meeting, we would be given copies of those documents as they were presented by one of the parties. In this particular case, we had to wait a day or two to get the email copies of these rebuttal papers. There's the difference, but the point was we had the issue was one of merit, the responsibility in the contract for a certain particular task. But just, we also this month I had 2 other hearings scheduled involving both time and money. Those have been settled, but they were scheduled to go on. As far as I'm concerned, I would give it a solid result. There are some things that are different. You don't have the ability to scan the room, to look at the people, to get the feel for what is making impacts for different people. You miss that. You miss, I know there's a mechanism of doing this, but you miss the chance of sliding a piece of paper to your fellow board member, or having a caucus at lunchtime, or that. I know there are ways of doing that, but it's not spontaneous. It's not the same. But the bottom line is it's workable. And frankly, before I went through the hearing, I was one of the biggest doubters as to the effectiveness of hearings on the virtual medium. But now I support it. Although absolutely, I far prefer the on-site meeting.
Sure. Hal, can I ask as a follow-up question, is there anything that you think you would do differently at a future hearing based on the experience of that first one? For example, you mentioned missing the lunchtime caucuses and that sort of thing. Would you aim to try to find a solution for some of those things, or anything that you would not do next time around?
Well, I think Elizabeth pointed out that you have the ability, you can, we had the option of cutting off the meeting at lunchtime and then resuming after lunch. And first of all, let me go back on one thing. Each of the parties had control of the screen during their presentation. And during the rebuttal, it got a little fuzzy going back and forth, but essentially they controlled it. So that was extremely important. No, but what I would do in the future, I would definitely have set up a caucus with the board members at the lunch hour, for instance. We did have a post-hearing conference, but I would just add that.
All right, very good. Well, this has been some very useful insight. Thank you for sharing that. I'd like to conclude this portion of the discussion by asking each panelist to give a short assessment of the virtual meetings and hearings. I've been hearing it sprinkled a little bit throughout your comments today, but I think it'll just be a nice end cap to this discussion. So if you could give us an assessment, do you think it's been a disaster? Is it useful only in a crisis situation? Or do you feel like this is something that's here to stay? And you can add a short explanation of why you feel this way. So I think I'll kick it off with Andy, and then we'll rotate around to Hal, Leo, and Elizabeth. So Andy, your views, please.
I think, as I said before, I think it's a medium that's been thrust upon us out of necessity, but I think it's pushed us forward a number of years in the way it's going. I spend far too much time sitting in aeroplanes, sitting in cars on bumpy roads and that. And now you can experience a medium, which we're all still learning, that can obviate a lot of that. It can cut down the expense of the dispute board for a project in a remote area. But obviously we have to develop practices, develop rules, platforms that we're going to use. I think, and I'd agree with Hal, you cannot replace the personal relationships. So I think at the early stages, maybe you need more personal intervention, and maybe during the middle phase of the project, you can cut back and so forth. But I think it's definitely here to stay. I support it. Perhaps you can look at ways of interspersing, having more regular online coupled with in-person site visits and meetings. Okay, and sorry, the one thing it does keeps the communication going, which is the most vital piece of dispute avoidance.
Good point. Thank you. Hal, your comments.
Well, I think it's very definitely useful for crisis situations, and it's a very useful tool. And I agree with Andy. We are going to see the use of this type of communication more frequently in years to come. Now, as far as my recommendation, I think it's, if you have a very smooth project, good communication between the parties, very few issues, I can easily see that if you would normally have in our case in the US, quarterly meetings, I can see 1 or 2 of those a year being virtual meetings. But I've been on some projects where the people do not communicate until the DRB shows up. And for that type of project, the DRB has to be there. Remember, we're in dispute avoidance, and we're not, yes, it's nice to cut costs, but we're trying to avoid disputes and really give value to the service of the DRB. So on certain projects, I would not use it at all. On others, yes.
Thank you, Hal. You're right. The best cost control is that dispute avoidance component. Leo, your comments.
Yeah, as I said already before, I'm all for it. I've listened carefully to what Andy said, and I listened carefully to what Hal just said. And I actually both have got some components that I strongly believe in. I think you have to make a difference or differentiation between site meetings and site hearings. Site meetings are a lot easier for the parties and the DAB or the DRB to deal with on a virtual manner, in a virtual manner. When you're talking about site hearings, you talk about referrals, you talk already about disputes that need to be decided upon. And there it's a bit more difficult, but I'm also convinced that the parties, as well as we as the practitioners, having been forced to deal with this now for quite some weeks and months, also we get used to it and we find ways to become more pragmatic with it. So I think it's here to stay. So yes, Andy, I agree with you. And Hal, I hear what you say, but I think over time, we also learn how to deal with that particular component that you just addressed. I think we need to be aware of what's happening around us and deal with it. So yeah, I'm all for it.
Very good. All right. Well, the final word goes to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, what's your assessment overall?
I think there's nothing that beats an in-person meeting. So I'm all for getting back to actually going to the project, meeting with the people. But I think that virtual meetings have been very helpful in keeping the trust going between all the parties and the DRB members, keeping that trust going, and definitely dispute avoidance. I think it's been a very effective way of meeting. And I guess what I see is, that the dispute board, the chair and the members should continue to be innovative and continue to be flexible and continue to be nimble. We don't know exactly how long, if there's going to be a second wave of COVID-19. We just don't know what it's going to be right now. And it's been really great listening, Andy, to you talk about these remote projects in Africa, because I can see how virtual meetings would be, very helpful to maybe if there's 4 meetings a year or a meeting every month or whatever, some of those could be virtual instead of actual face-to-face. But I think actually going to the project and seeing that the road is being built or the status of the bridge or, whatever the project is, nothing beats actually being at the project to see that. I think it's really onerous to look at a lot of photographs You know, I think that, you know, to videos and drone shots and all of that are just terrific, but nothing beats actually being able to walk the site yourself. So I think they're great. I think they're probably here to stay, but I think we should get back to meeting face to face soon when we can, safely. Safely is the key.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I hope so.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. We're now going to move into the question and answer section of today's webinar. As a reminder, all questions should be entered in the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. And we do ask you to include what country you're from if you can. That might help frame the response. And also who you would like to address your question. You've heard a variety of experiences here today, so there may be one panelist who is particularly well suited to the question that you have. I'm going to turn it over to our team member, Kimberly Peterson, who's been monitoring the Q&A. And if you could please share the first question from our audience for the panelists to react to.
Sure, there's been a lot of really good questions. We do have a question from Jerry Brodsky. He is a US member. And the question, it's more related not so much to hearings and board meetings, but more about training. And I wanted to get some people's opinions on that. So let me read his question for you. This is a question on what I'd like to get ideas from anyone and everyone regarding the use of technology training. What techniques and technology platforms can be used for virtual training, large groups of prospective board members, and being able to gauge their interest and participation during the course for quality control purposes, so we can legitimately sign their certificates at the end stating they are qualified to serve as board members. They're considering having everyone use 2 screens, one for materials, the other for face-to-face contact, as well as pop quizzes during the training. So thoughts, please. And I think, Anne, you and I have been researching this, so let me ask you this question.
Fair enough. Yes, the DRBF has had some experience with delivering some virtual workshops online. And we are also in the process of planning some future workshops this year, which Jerry is one of the people that's working on a specific project. I've been gathering some feedback from various members who are actively engaged in delivering training for other organizations and other professional tasks that they're involved in. So we've received some good tips from Anton van Langelaar, for example, in South Africa, who told me about his experience spreading out the sessions. This was mentioned earlier, even in a hearing, about keeping things to 3 to 4 hours because of the fatigue that sets in online. So those things are relevant both in the meetings and hearings process as well as training, all the different ways that we can use the virtual space. But I'd also like to maybe ask Leo to comment, because Leo has been an active trainer doing workshops online and has shared some of his experience with me. And I think it would be good for Jerry and the other attendees to hear his experience there and how it may relate.
Thank you, Anne. Yes, I've, for the last 5 years now, I've been involved in doing online training sessions, not necessarily for the DRBF, but for another organization. And we have been using the Podio platform for doing these training sessions. The Podio platform is only there to create a classroom. Obviously, all the other software packages that we've been talking about earlier on, like Zoom and GoToMeeting and Microsoft Teams and everything else, they allow you to do webinar sessions like we're doing today. But if you're going to do courses, workshops online, especially if you're doing them over a number of days, you need a separate platform altogether where the students can come together and communicate amongst themselves, also in between online sessions. And as I said, there's also there a variety of platforms available. But all in all, I find it very easy to do these workshops online because the students' communication with the trainers over the chat line, over the video line, and also in between sessions by email allows it to be very, very effective. what I have to say is that during a live session, we answer questions as trainers that we can easily answer, and the students are aware that if they have a more complicated one, or we decide it's too complicated at that moment in time, we ask them to rephrase the question in the classroom on the Podio platform. And then we as trainers in between sessions go back in the next day or after a day or two and answer the questions in detail. And everybody is quite happy with that. So I think it's a very good way of doing courses. Having said that, DABs, hearings, acting as a DAB in practice, you need to do this face-to-face in training. It's very difficult to do this online.
Thank you, Leo. Something that occurred to me as we've been talking is that we might need to address a unit on how to handle virtual meetings and hearings for the short term in our training, and then think about how that plays out over the long term as well. Kim, do we have another question from the audience?
You know, before you move on, I wanted to just add that one thing I found very helpful with becoming familiar with the Zoom platform, which is very similar to WebEx, et cetera, is to actually get into like a small training group where you meet once or twice a week or once every 2 weeks, so that you can actually get together and share being the host. You can share screen, figure out how to do that, figure out, you know, just the different elements of working on the platform that you want to work on. I found that to be very helpful. So I would encourage that, to create your own group of people that you know, dispute board members that you want to get together and learn the platforms and, you know, work on chat, breakout rooms, etc. So sorry about that. Yep.
If I would add to what Elizabeth's saying, and not quite on the training thing, where this sort of platform also helps, and I think I mentioned earlier in my speech, where we have a dispute, which is a very difficult and complex one, where you can actually set up, and what we have is set up fortnightly feedback and meeting sessions to make sure that the momentum is kept on in trying to work through the claim, identify issues at the earliest stage, and present them to the DB and saying, please help, which way should we go, left or right, and that. And so therefore you can go through a stepwise process to help the parties resolve and avoid a dispute totally. So you can fit in fortnightly meetings, weekly meetings, monthly, whatever, through this sort of platform. It doesn't take you 2 days to get there.
All right, very good. Well, let's move on. We do have quite a number of questions coming in from our attendees. So Kim, can you tee us up with the next one?
Sure, this question is from Igor, and I apologize, I will not try your last name to butcher it. This is Igor from Macedonia, and he has a question regarding DAB hearings. His question is, the DAB hearings are usually not minuted or recorded. How to apply this in a situation when the participants have the possibility to actually record the meeting or hearing? Let me address this one to Elizabeth first, since I know she's had this experience.
So you know, it's interesting. I'm a member of the American Arbitration Association, ICDR panel, and they have a requirement that the parties agree that they will not record the session. You have to sign that. In the Zoom format, anybody who's attending can record, but you know, that presents all sorts of problems. You know, translating the recording to something in writing. You know, it presents a lot of issues. So my recommendation is to reinforce and enforce that nobody will record the actual virtual meeting.
Very good, thank you. Kim, another question.
Yes, let's address Marlon from Brazil. He asks, do you think the remote meetings may cause a decrease in the prevention of disputes, as sometimes it will be more difficult to establish a rapport between the participants, for instance? Leo, why don't we have you address this question?
That's a very interesting one. I think it's still a little bit early to answer that question because we've only been dealing with it now for a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 months at the most now. I do go back to what we were talking about earlier, and that is that if you have live physical meetings, the DAB, the DRB, the dispute board is much more in a position to adjudge the parties' feelings and emotions. And when we talk about dispute avoidance, one important aspect of dispute avoidance, in my view, is to judge as a dispute board member exactly these emotions at times where you don't have the dispute yet. That's the time when you can actually step in and help the parties. But you need to be there to do that. It's virtually impossible to do this online. I agree with that. So whether it will help avoid disputes, I can't really answer that. I think time will have to tell us that.
Thank you very much. Do you have any comments, Andy? I see you pop up. Was that just a...
I think it came to me. Look, I think you've got to make a judgment call. And I think the dispute board is probably the best positioned to determine whether it's time to make sure we have a face-to-face meeting. I would be, personally, at my experience so far, I would be reluctant to have too large a space between in-person meetings. You need to be sure and to pick up all the body language, the interpersonal relationship. How do people react during the tea break? Okay, so if they're all in separate corners and never speaking to each other during the tea break. So you need to be able to see, are the engineer, the contractor, and the employer, are they working as a team? If they are, then it bodes well for your project. If they're all in, one's in the red corner, the other's in the blue corner, you know you're going to have a boxing match.
Thank you, Andy. That's a good lead in to the next question.
Let me comment, Kim, if I can, on that. A big part of the dispute board effectiveness is personal relationships. And we are evaluating the parties are evaluating us. And that can only be done. You can't do that on a screen. You don't get, as many of us have said today, the relationships between the parties, the body language between the parties. You can only judge that by being there. And I think to address the original question, will dispute avoidance effectiveness be reduced by a preponderance of virtual meetings? The answer is yes, in my opinion. We can only keep the avoidance part going by face-to-face meetings, a preponderance of face-to-face meetings.
This question is from Warren from the US, and I believe this would be addressed to Hal, as you've just spoken about hearings. Please explain how caucuses are handled during a hearing.
Well, the caucus, there are mechanisms on these platforms to chat, and you can restrict your comments to particular parties. I have not used it, but I understand that is possible. The other way, of course, is when there are prolonged breaks, you can have a caucus. But there is a chat, I think in GoToMeeting, certainly, maybe Microsoft Teams, there is the chat that you can restrict to one person or two people.
I think that my experience is that on Zoom, the chat is only, you can chat with either everybody or one person. So there's not really an opportunity to use the chat feature to talk with two people if you have 3 dispute board members. You can always, you can always have a phone call. So you can end or suspend, your virtual meeting And you can have a conference call with the 3 dispute board members. You can also set up another meeting. I've used the breakout rooms very effectively with Zoom, and it is an opportunity. You have to be the host really to effectuate that. Although, you know, anybody who's a host could probably, you could ask them to do that. But when you're in a breakout room, it's actually the three dispute board members having a private caucus, and nobody else can hear you. It's just like we are right now talking with each other. And I think that that's very effective. So there's a number of different ways. You can always use your cell phone. We can set up, you know, a FaceTime meeting or some other platform to have the 3 people talk.
Well, I think you're right. I think, but you want, when you are going to have a prolonged chat, it's not going to be a minute or 2. It's going to be during a break or during a lunch period or something like that, when then you can go to a different medium. If you're in Microsoft Teams, you go to your Zoom. If you're in go to meeting, you go to some other format and communicate with your partners. But during the hearing itself, it's not too practical.
Hi, I'd like to chime in with another question that we have from Jerry in the US, and this aligns with something that I heard from another one of our DRBF members working in Africa. The question is, are there challenges to go virtual, bigger in countries with recently emerging dispute board traditions and experience? And the add-on I have to that is that one of our members is having his very first dispute board, and it is also the first dispute board meeting for both parties, the employer and the contractor. So they are getting off on their first dispute board only in the virtual platform. So thinking about how that may affect the experience of the board and all of the parties, and then also this concept from Jerry of whether it's stronger pressure in emerging places where they're just getting familiar with the dispute board process and may not already have that inherent understanding and knowledge of the importance of in-person meetings and site visits, etc. So maybe I'll kick this over first to Andy to comment, and then we'll open it up to the other panelists as well.
Right. I think I've never had my first meeting virtually. I think I would approach that with quite a lot of trepidation, particularly if you don't know the parties. If the parties are unfamiliar with the dispute board process, the first site meeting is important to set the ground rules, the way you're going to operate, what you expect out of the parties. Quite a challenge, I would say. But in today's environment, I don't think we have any alternative. You can't say to the parties, well, let's wait 6 months into the project to have our first meeting. So we must try our best. I wouldn't volunteer in a post-COVID situation to have my first site visit virtually. No, I think that's got to be hands-on to sum up the parties and to get that view of the site and what is going on.
Any other panelists keen to chime in for this one?
Yes, yeah. One of the meetings I had last month was the first meeting. Now, it's the perfect storm when you have inexperienced DRB people and inexperienced parties, and in a third world country. I can't imagine a more tenuous situation than that. But there was an urgency to have a first meeting because the project had been ongoing for a year and the board had just been seated. And I felt it was important that we get to know each other virtually, if no other way. So the agenda was sent out, and basically I used the meeting, I'm the chair, to do, normally when I'm running the first meeting, I explain in detail what the DRB is all about, ask the owner to give an overview of schedule, key elements of the project, introduce the management structure, ask the contractor to do the same, and then bring up any outstanding issues. In this particular case, we had the meeting scheduled for last month, and we did everything because there were not only a first meeting, but there were 3 projects and 2 separate contractors. And we excluded the contractors discussing their issues for that particular first meeting. And we have set up a face-to-face meeting a couple of months from now. But you are in these cases when it's a first time, and both of these, well, at least the one party was a first time experience in DRBs. So I think in the first meeting, if it has to be virtual, you try to make it informational, instructional, and avoid, at least if there are multiple contractors, avoid discussing their issues at that particular time. That was just the way I handled that.
All right. Very
So,
good. Thank you, Hal.
I just have a quick comment.
Actually, we are at the 1 hour mark for this webinar, and so we are coming to the conclusion, and some attendees may need to sign off. However, I notice we are having great dialogue, and there are a number of unanswered questions still in our Q&A. So the panelists have agreed to stay on for an additional 10 to 15 minutes to keep the discussion going. So if you're watching, I invite you to stay and participate, but if you need to sign off, of course, we are still recording, and this will be available for viewing later. I do want to move on to another question. It's a 2-part question from our member, Abdullah in Istanbul. And so I'm going to start with the first one, and then I'll come in with the second. So first off, what are your expectations about the impact of virtual hearings in terms of reducing the time required to solve the disputes with respect to conventional procedures? So maybe I'll turn that one over to Andy or Elizabeth. Either of you feel comfortable thinking about the reduction of time in comparison to conventional procedures? Any thoughts?
So I'd be glad to give an initial response to that before Andy. I think that when you're talking about hearing disputes using the virtual format, you have to think that it's probably going to take a little more time. First of all, I think that, you know, preparing for the virtual meeting is important because of the logistics of looking at documents. You know, so you want to be able to review, you know, the briefs, what the parties are saying about the dispute, and all of the documents that they're trying to support that beforehand, so that in the virtual meeting, it's not somebody saying, here's this document, you know, you have a pile and you've put your own tabs on it or whatever, so that you can actually be familiar with the documents. I think that, you know, the amount of time for the actual meeting can be increased, you know, as a result of just logistics. I also think that people get tired, so you've got to allow in some breaks. And I think a lot of times when you're doing a virtual meeting, let's push it, you know, okay, everybody, you know, take 5 minutes. Well, in reality, if you were in a face-to-face meeting, you'd be taking 15 minutes. So I think fatigue comes in. So I think it can take as much time or more time. Andy, do you have something?
I think I agree with you 100%. It will take more time. You have to be careful to make sure that if you're looking up documents, that everybody's got the right document open in front of them before you proceed. If you're in person, well, you can see if a guy is still hunting through his files trying to find the right document. You've got to be cautious that way. You've also got to be very careful, say if it's a multicultural project where English isn't the first language of the participants, to make sure now you've got this format to try and understand that people. Life's a lot easier when you're face to face. If you've got a pretty patchy internet and somebody speaking a language or has got a strong accent, you've got to be doubly careful to make sure you afford the time to fully understand what is being said.
Very good. Thank you, Andy. Now, Abdullah had another question, and I know that Leo will be able to answer this very well for him. The question is, do you expect that various institutions are going to publish certain recommended practices or rules to conduct virtual hearings? Leo?
I'm convinced that that's what's going to happen. Organizations like FIDIC have already started that process. And I think other institutions like the ICC and also the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators have started that process. And it's only natural that they've done so. Everybody has recognized that we need to do something about having meetings because, as Andy said before, we can't just say to the parties, well, forget about your disputes for the next six or 7 months and come back when we have no more COVID. It doesn't work like that in economical practice. So we have to. And I can also say that within the DRBF, we are currently working on some of these things. Because, as I said before to you, Anne, in another discussion, we are the leading organization in the world dealing with dispute boards. So if anybody is going to get some guidelines and recommendations on how to conduct yourself online when using dispute boards, I think the world of construction is looking at us. So we have a duty to do this. Yes, there should be.
Very good, thank you. I have a question here from Joseph Allen in Northern Ohio. Hal, this one's for you. His experience with the DRB and DRA process is that quite often the site tours initiate substantive conversations between contract team members regarding potentially significant project issues and solutions. He also, comments on the opportunity to observe body language and interpersonal reactions to detect potential problems. So this is something that's been touched on a little bit, but can you go a little deeper, Hal, from your perspective on how to handle that when the experience to date has been quarterly meetings, even with large projects, having a lot of complex things happening in that in-person site visit?
Well, I've said before that there is no substitute for an in-person site visit. And it is true that in the site tours that I've taken many times, there are issues that arise between the parties on the site tour. And so it's something you miss. And if you're totally structured and totally rehearsed and totally pointed to certain issues on a virtual basis, you're not going to get that. And it's particularly important in hearings, meetings first, and also hearings. It's important to get the body language of the different people. And there's no substitute for that in virtual meetings. So it isn't the same. It's good, but it isn't the same.
I think one thing that, happens in reality is that when you're out on a site visit, sometimes conversations start, or this is what I was talking about, and not everybody's involved. And that's just the reality of, you try not to have that happen. You try not to have private conversations. You want to have everybody involved. But in the virtual meeting, everybody's there. And I think it actually fosters, that trust that everybody's hearing everything. So if you're having somebody share screen and they're sharing, a video of walking through the site and they're saying, this is what I was talking about, everybody's hearing that at the same time and they can explain more of what they're talking about. So I think the virtual actually works very well if you have, either a photograph or a video or, you know, Google Maps or whatever you're working on, whatever platform is being shared, if it's of good quality, I think that's important. But it gives everybody a chance to hear what everybody's saying.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I will ask the next question. This is from John Westland of Canada. He did have a comment about virtual and face-to-face, and his question is, rather than a question of doing face-to-face or virtual, do you think we're going to move forward with a combination of face-to-face and virtual? Let me have Andy address this question. What are your thoughts on that?
I personally think that is a definite, particularly where there's long travel times, long distance. I would not be recommending that instead of having site visits once every 3 months, you say, well, let's make them virtually, one virtual, and then 3 months later have in person. What I think would be better is to have a combination where you can have infill meetings virtually. Perhaps have your site visits every 4 months rather than 3, and then every second month have an infill follow-up meeting to make sure things are still going. I think if you start spacing things out, the in-person meetings, for all the reasons that have already been stated, if you start staggering out meetings too far apart to try and save money, you actually defeat the object of the real money that is saved by avoiding disputes.
Very good. Thank you, Andy. We have another question from Igor about overcoming the issue of the obligation to visit the site, to be physically present. He asks specifically under FIDIC Red Book 1999, but I think it would be in any contract that has this requirement. How are people dealing with that? Are amendments to the DAA necessary in order to accommodate remote site visits and meetings? How's that being handled? Leo, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can. The question is relevant specifically for FIDIC type of contracts. If a FIDIC type of contract is underlying the project, then the FIDIC rules for dispute boards are by implication the basis of how the dispute board, is to operate. And one of the things that the FIDIC book does say is that the DB has to meet with the parties between 70 and 140 days in intervals. Not less than 70, not more than 140. So if you're going into this virtual mode and you have to deal with infill meetings, like Andy said, you might end up in a situation whereby you might, all depends on the definition, Andy, of what an infill meeting is, but you might end up in something that is less than 70, which goes outside your DAA, because you have to uphold what FIDIC says. If it takes longer than that, you go above the 140 days. So yes, I think if this is going to be a reality on the site, I think it might be a very good idea to agree with the parties upfront in your DAA that these things might or can happen, and therefore have the parties approval or consent to this right from the start.
All right, very good. Thank you, Leo. Well, we are getting to the end of our time together today. So I want to wrap up with a final question from DRBF member Sam Ahmad in South Africa. He commented that there's been some very useful ideas emerging from this discussion and asked whether the DRBF would consider consolidating guidelines on conducting meetings and hearings online. I know this is something that Leo touched on earlier, but I just wanted to bring that around full circle and tell you that yes, we are planning on gathering some best practice recommendations that will be helpful for you to consider and implement based on the collective experience that we've had to date. So we will do a summary of today's discussion published very quickly in the next day for you all. But we are also integrating some of these ideas and comments into a best practices document, which will be circulated to all members and published externally as well, and available in our library on our website, along with a link to the recording from today's session and the one that will occur again a little bit later today with some different panelists. We'll have both Leo and Elizabeth present for that one, as well as our experienced member Toshihiko Emoto participating in that call. So thank you all for participating today. I want to thank the panelists especially for their expertise, and also the audience for your interest and engagement with the topic. We did not get to all the questions today, but we will aim to address those either directly with you or through the context of those best practice document that we get in circulation soon. As you sign off, you will be asked to take a minute or two to share some feedback on the experience today, as well as your ideas for future webinars. We suspect that this will be something that we continue to do to engage our members and our external audiences in keeping dispute boards alive and growing and responding in that nimble way that Elizabeth referenced earlier. So as always, I thank you for your membership and your support of the dispute board process worldwide. Thank you.